So let's look at how the attribute routing affects any lower level code you're working with, like the controller selector that we created in previous modules. If you remember earlier in this module, we had commented out our controller selector. Let me uncomment it, and let's talk about what's going on here. If we just build it and run it, we're going to get an odd error which says value cannot be null. And when we look at it, it's actually looking at find entry, which comes down to actually try get value, which is a call we're making inside of our select controller, inside of the counting case controller selector. So let's see what's actually happening. Let's open up the controller selector. And we can see that we're calling try get value here on the controller name. If you haven't seen the versioning module, essentially we're using the name of the controller to see if there is a new version of that controller. And we have a couple of different ways of determining what the version is, whether it's from the query string, the header, the accept header, or from the media type. So we expect that we're going to get an actual controller name in our route values. Let's see what happens there. I'm going to run this so I can debug it. Let's go ahead and just refresh. And what we can see is that the controller name is null. And the reason is we are now getting route data that includes information about what route it's trying to match. And we're going to see that the route values for controller doesn't exist. That's why this is returning a null value here, as it is correctly converting it into a string, but the value of controller is null, so that there is no controller name. If we change this to one of the other routes, like one of the measure routes, it simply works. We can see the controller name here is measures because when it matched one of the routes defined in the Web API config, one of the old style, it had a name associated with it. So it went ahead and dealt with the correct route, so our versioning could run its little code and do its magic. But if we go back to foods, what we're going to find in the route data, and this is where it becomes interesting, is that the route data includes several values, of which, if we dig down deep enough, is going to match a controller that doesn't have a name. Well, that's interesting. So we can't find the controller name on the route data. The reason is that our route data, let's go ahead and look at the actual route itself, and this route is actually something called a route collection route. And this is a route that contains a number of different routes. It's basically a container for other routes. And there are 5 routes in there. That seems odd. Why 5? Well, if we look at each of these routes, it's going to start to look familiar. API stats, API stat ID, API stat name, and then nutrition foods and nutrition foods food ID. So this is one route collection that's being treated at the same level as our old routes that actually has the number of routes of all the attribute routes that were defined throughout our project. And this is the reason why we can't actually get at the name. This also means that versioning, when you're using attribute routes, can get a little sticky because how do you make this difference? We had made a decision in Web API 1 that this was a fine way of figuring out the different version. We're going to actually have to determine a different way to do this versioning. And it's going to depend on your use case exactly how you're going to do this. You're still going to be getting that data, but you can't depend on the controller name anymore. You're probably going to have to dig into those subcontroller names and look for those versions as well. In order to get around this and just make the versioning work for our non-attribute routes, we're simply going to say if controller name string is null, empty, or white space. So if we don't have a good controller name, let's do something different. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and rely on the other code. Now this module has a lot to cover, so we're not going to cover how to change it to incorporate versioning for these attribute routes. We're just going to say that we're not going to use versioning for the routes that don't have a controller name. And all we'll do is just say return base.select controller and pass it in the requests that are being handled. So it can just select the controller based on those subcontrollers because it already has code in there to support attribute routes. If we make that change, again, this means that none of the versioning code is going to run if the route we're going against is using an attribute, but that may be good enough for some cases. If we now go back and look at foods, we'll see that it now works again. And if we go to, let's say, one of the measures, that will also work. And if we had a specific version for this measures, it would also work. If we were using one of the versioning techniques, it would still run through that same code. And that is the big story about how attribute routing works. On the face of it, it works exactly the way you would expect it to. It's going to allow you to do routes at the controller level, and the routes are going to be closely tied to the actual controller and the controller methods, and that's actually a pretty good thing. But anytime you're going to deal with lower-end code that's going to be dealing with route names, you're going to have to think about how you're using those routes in a different way, and probably use the subroutes in order to get at some of that data. Let's talk about cross-origin resource sharing next.